In the final months of World War II, the small village of Kadena, nestled in the hills of Okinawa, was a place consumed by fear and anticipation. The inhabitants, mostly farmers and their families, lived under the constant shadow of impending doom. For years, they had been fed a steady diet of propaganda that painted the advancing American forces as monstrous invaders. The stories of brutality, torture, and bloodshed at the hands of the Americans were etched deeply into their minds. These were not just soldiers, they were beasts, savages who could not be reasoned with, only feared. Mika, a 32-year-old widow, lived in this village with her young son, Riku. She had been raised in the same atmosphere of fear, where the mere mention of surrender was considered treasonous. As the war raged on, Mika did not fear the loss of life, but the disgrace of survival. She had been taught that if they lost the war, there would be no future for them. It was better to die with honor than to live in shame. The idea of surrender, once a foreign concept, was now seen as the ultimate betrayal. Every morning, Mika would wake up to the smell of the burning fields, the sounds of distant explosions, and the faces of neighbors who had become accustomed to this relentless rhythm of violence. Her son, Riku, had grown up hearing stories of honor, sacrifice, and death. In school, the children were taught not just to obey the emperor, but to die for him, to lay down their lives rather than fall into enemy hands. The walls of their classrooms were adorned with paintings of brave boys leaping to their deaths from cliffs, their faces filled with pride and determination. Girls were taught similar lessons, praised for their willingness to slit their own throats to protect the nation's honor. At home, the lessons were no different. Mika's house was filled with the grim tools of survival. She kept knives hidden under the mats where they slept, ready to use them if the soldiers came. Poison pills had been distributed by the local authorities, and she had carefully tucked them away in case there was no other way out. The fear of being captured, of becoming one of the dishonored, was more terrifying than any bullet. It consumed her thoughts, her actions, and even her dreams. But despite all the preparation, there was still an underlying sense of helplessness, an understanding that no matter how prepared they were powerless against the might of the enemy. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one feeling like the last. The villagers had grown numb to the sound of air raids, to the cries of the wounded, to the sight of bodies being carried away. Life in Kadena had become a ritual of waiting. There was no hope, only the cold certainty of an inevitable end. Mika would pray each night, not for peace or victory, but for strength to face whatever was coming. Her prayers were for Riku, for him to be spared the horrors she had seen in her dreams. She feared what he would face, what would become of him if the American soldiers arrived. Yet, despite the hopelessness, she continued to move through the motions of daily life, cooking, cleaning, caring for her son, all while knowing that the end was near. When the news came that the American troops were approaching, the entire village fell into an eerie silence. The fear that had been building for months turned into a palpable tension that could be felt in every corner of the village. It was as though the air itself was holding its breath. Mika, like everyone else, prepared for the worst. The children were told to stay inside, away from the windows, away from any chance of seeing the enemy. The mothers gathered their children close, whispering words of comfort, while secretly wondering if this would be the day they would have to end their children's lives themselves. The men of the village, once proud farmers and fishermen, now stood with sharpened knives, waiting for the inevitable. They knew their duty. If the enemy came, they were to fight until the very end, to die with honor. But even they could not escape the crushing fear that weighed down on them. The soldiers, the invading forces, were no longer faceless figures in the distance. They were a reality that was about to crash into their lives. The stories of their cruelty were no longer just stories. They were about to become a horrifying truth. Mika's heart pounded in her chest as she sat with Riku, clutching him tightly to her. She looked out of the small window of their house, seeing nothing but dust in the distance. The ground trembled with the approaching rumble of tanks. It was only a matter of time before they arrived, before their lives were irrevocably changed. She had been raised to fear these soldiers, to believe that they were coming to destroy everything she held dear. But now, with the ground shaking beneath her feet, she began to question everything she had ever been told. Could it be true that they were nothing like the monsters they had been made to fear? Could there be a chance, a slim chance, that they were coming not to kill, but to save? For the villagers of Kadena, the concept of survival had already been abandoned. It was no longer about living, it was about dying with honor. And yet, as the tanks drew closer, there was a flicker of uncertainty, a momentary hesitation that ran through Mika and others like a shockwave. Could this really be the end? Or was there something else on the horizon, something that would shatter everything they had been led to believe? The fear, the hatred, and the resolve that had kept them bound for so long were about to be tested in ways they never imagined. The rumble of distant artillery was the first sign. It was faint at first, like a low growl on the wind, but it steadily grew louder, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The American forces were no longer just a threat lingering at the edges of their awareness. They were drawing closer, their presence now unavoidable. In the days that followed, the villagers of Kadena went into a quiet frenzy. The men of the village began to gather their meager belongings, making preparations for what they knew was coming, and what they feared more than anything, the arrival of the enemy. Mika's heart clenched as she sat beside her son, her hands trembling as she tried to comfort him. Riku was unusually quiet, his eyes wide with fear as the sound of artillery grew nearer. They both knew what this meant, what had been drilled into them for years. When the Americans came, death was the only way out. The propaganda had worked. The fear had been ingrained so deeply that it felt like a physical weight. For Mika, the thought of surrender was worse than death itself. She had no choice but to prepare her son for the worst, even if that meant teaching him how to end his life if it came to that. Each day grew more tense as the sound of gunfire and explosions echoed in the distance. The villagers moved like ghosts, faces pale, eyes hollow with fear. The children were kept inside, away from the windows, while the adults went about their tasks with grim determination. The women, like Mika, prepared their homes for the final days. They tucked knives and poison into hidden corners, checking and rechecking their supplies, as though they could somehow hold off the inevitable with mere preparations. But deep down, Mika knew that nothing they could do would protect them from what was coming. Nothing could save them now. As the days passed, the villagers began to notice small signs of the approaching American forces. The once bustling roads that connected Kadena to the rest of Okinawa grew eerily empty as farmers abandoned their fields, unable to continue working with the constant threat of attack hanging over them. Some of the braver souls ventured out to collect supplies, but even those who had once been fearless now moved with cautious steps, as if they could feel the danger closing in around them. The sky seemed darker now, as though even nature itself was preparing for the inevitable storm. Mika's thoughts were consumed by the future, by the fear of what would come when the soldiers finally arrived. She wondered if the stories were true, if the Americans would really kill everyone, if they would burn their homes and take their children. She had heard the rumors, just like everyone else. They had been repeated so many times that they had become gospel. The American soldiers were beasts, they said, with no mercy, no compassion. They would stop at nothing to destroy everything in their path. Mika had no reason to believe otherwise. After all, the evidence was clear. The destruction, the deaths,
The horrors that had followed the Americans wherever they went, how could it be anything else? And yet, even in the midst of her terror, Mika felt something shift. The fear that had gripped her for so long began to twist into something else, uncertainty. Could it be that the enemy wasn't as monstrous as they had been led to believe? Could the stories, the warnings, the propaganda all be lies? No, Mika thought, that was impossible. It was too late for doubt. The enemy was coming, and they were coming to destroy. There was no room for second chances, no time for hesitation. She had raised her son to be prepared for this moment, to face death with honor. But now, with each passing hour, she could feel the weight of her own fear. On the eve of their arrival, Mika sat in silence, holding Riku close as the sound of artillery grew louder. The villagers had gathered in the small homes, the men sitting quietly, sharpening knives, and the women moving about, preparing food for the final days. Everyone knew that they might never see another sunrise. The thought of surrender was as alien as the idea of survival. The only thing that mattered now was how they would face the inevitable. Would they fight, or would they follow the instructions they had been given for so many years, to take their own lives before the enemy could do it for them? As the night wore on, a strange calm settled over the village. The fear was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. It had become something else, a quiet, resigned acceptance. The villagers sat together in the dark, their eyes filled with a mixture of dread and determination. The American soldiers were coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. All they could do now was wait and hope that, when the time came, they would find the courage to face whatever came next. In the distance, the sound of approaching tanks could be heard. The earth trembled beneath their feet as the ground vibrated with the weight of the vehicles. Mika's breath caught in her throat as she tightened her grip around Riku. The moment had arrived. She could feel the tension in the air, the crackling of static that filled the silence between the explosions. It was impossible to predict what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Their lives, their futures, would never be the same again. The morning of May 5, 1945, dawned like any other in war-torn Kadena, grim and heavy with the weight of the unknown. The air was thick with smoke from distant fires, and the smell of earth, dust, and sweat hung in the stillness. Mika, as always, woke early, the cold weight of anxiety sitting heavy on her chest. She moved mechanically, her body carrying out the motions of daily life without thought, boiling rice, preparing what little food they had left. Riku, still sleepy, sat quietly beside her, staring out of the window with wide, uncertain eyes. There was a strange calm before the storm, a lull in the chaos that seemed unnatural given the circumstances. Yet it was only a matter of time before the war would knock at their door. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The low rumble of artillery grew louder, followed by the deafening crack of shells landing nearby. The earth seemed to shake violently with each impact, as if the very ground was protesting the violence that had been unleashed upon it. Mika instinctively grabbed Riku, pulling him close to her chest as she tried to shield him from the falling debris. The walls around them groaned under the weight of the explosions, and the ceiling above them cracked open with a terrifying roar. It was a nightmare that had come to life, the reality they had feared for so long now crashing down upon them. Before she could react, the roof caved in, and everything around them seemed to collapse in on itself. Mika instinctively threw herself over Riku, her body acting on pure adrenaline, protecting her child with everything she had. The world spun into chaos as beams and debris rained down, trapping them beneath the rubble. Mika's heart raced, the sound of her own breathing deafening in her ears. She could feel the weight of the fallen beams pressing down on her, but it was nothing compared to the fear in her chest. She had no idea how much time they had, how long they could survive under the rubble. All she knew was that her son was under her, and she would do whatever it took to protect him. As the dust settled and the sounds of explosions faded into the background, Mika's mind raced. She pushed against the debris with all her strength, trying to lift the heavy beam that pinned Riku to the ground, but it was too heavy. Her fingers scraped against the jagged edges of the wood, blood oozing from the cuts, but still she couldn't budge the beam. She called out his name, her voice hoarse with panic, but Riku's only response was a whimper. His leg was trapped, twisted awkwardly beneath the weight of the timber, and he was crying, his small voice barely audible over the noise of the collapsing house. Mika could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she fought to keep it under control. Her son needed her, and if she didn't stay calm, she would never get them out of this mess. She whispered reassurances to him, telling him to stay still, to be brave, but deep down she knew the truth. Time was running out. Another shell could hit at any moment, and if that happened, they would be buried alive. The thought sent a chill through her spine, but there was no time to dwell on it. Her priority was to get Riku free, to make sure he was safe. Outside, the sounds of the battlefield continued, the echoes of war mingling with the cries of the wounded. Mika could hear the distant sounds of gunfire, the sharp crack of sniper shots cutting through the air. The village was under siege, and it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on her. The smoke from the explosions was creeping in through the cracks in the rubble, filling the air with a choking, acrid scent. Her lungs burned with each breath, and the air felt heavier by the second. But even in the midst of this chaos, Mika could not bring herself to leave her son. She wouldn't abandon him, not now, not when he needed her most. Then, just as she thought she could take no more, she heard something that stopped her cold. Voices, not in Japanese, but in English. The words were muffled, distant, but unmistakable. "Is anyone alive?" The voice sounded almost concerned. Mika's breath caught in her throat as she realized that they weren't alone. The Americans had come. The very soldiers they had been taught to fear, the monsters who would come to kill them, were now outside, calling for survivors. Mika's heart pounded in her chest, and her instincts screamed at her to stay silent. She covered Riku's mouth with her hand, as if to protect him from the very people who were supposed to be the enemy. But then, the voice spoke again, this time in broken Japanese. "We help, we help." The words seemed surreal, out of place, a contradiction to everything Mika had ever known. She froze, her mind reeling. The American soldiers, the ones she had been told to fear above all else, were offering help? The thought was impossible to reconcile with everything she had been taught. Her fingers trembled, still clutching her son, but she couldn't help the part of her that began to doubt the stories, the lies. This was not the monster she had been told to expect. With a mixture of fear and disbelief, Mika called out, her voice barely a whisper, "Help! Help us!" It was a cry born of desperation, of a mother's instinct to protect her child at any cost. As soon as the words left her mouth, she regretted them. What if they were lying? What if they were just pretending to be kind, only to kill them once they were vulnerable? But it was too late. She had spoken, and now there was no turning back. She could only wait and see what would come of this. Moments later, a figure appeared through the haze of dust and debris. A young man in a green uniform, his eyes wide with caution, but also with something else, concern. He raised his hand slowly, as if to show he meant no harm. Mika held her breath, watching him carefully, not knowing whether to trust him or not. But there he was, kneeling beside her son, examining the beam that pinned him down. He didn't speak, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. In that moment, everything Mika thought she knew about the enemy began to unravel. This was not the monster she had been warned about. This was a man, a soldier, trying to save her son.
The soldier moved with purpose, despite the chaos around him. Mika watched, her heart pounding in her chest as the man assessed the situation with a calmness that defied the horror of their surroundings. He didn't hesitate. His hands reached for the beam, and for a moment, everything felt as if it were happening in slow motion. Mika could hardly believe what she was seeing. This was an American soldier, the enemy, but he was acting not as a killer, but as a savior. He moved quickly but cautiously, searching for a way to lift the heavy timber that trapped Riku beneath it. His eyes were focused, his brow furrowed with concentration as he worked to free her son. Mika's first instinct was to tell him to stop, to warn him to be careful. The stories she had heard, the nightmares her people had lived through, screamed that this was a trap. But deep down, something told her that this soldier was not here to kill them. He was here to save them. He spoke again, in the broken Japanese he had used before, softly, reassuringly. "It's okay, we're going to get him out." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of hope that Mika hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. Hope was dangerous. It led to betrayal. But in that moment, it felt almost impossible to ignore. With his hands still gripping the edge of the beam, the soldier shifted his weight, using his legs to press against the rubble, slowly lifting the heavy wood. Mika felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest, but it was quickly smothered by the weight of the situation. She could see Riku's leg pinned beneath the beam, his little body trembling with pain. His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale and tear-streaked. Mika's heart broke for him, for the suffering he was enduring, and for the realization that, even in this moment, she was powerless to protect him. The soldier's hands were shaking now, sweat dripping from his forehead as he struggled to lift the beam. It was clear that the task was taking its toll on him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Mika watched, helpless, her eyes locked on her son, willing him to stay still, to stay quiet, to be brave. She whispered soothing words to him, though they felt empty in her mouth. "Stay still, Riku. Please stay still." But the pain in his eyes told her he was too scared to listen. The soldier continued to strain against the weight of the beam, his body trembling with exertion. It felt like hours had passed, though in reality it had been mere minutes. Finally, with a sharp grunt, the soldier managed to shift the beam just enough to loosen its hold on Riku's leg. Mika's breath caught in her throat as she saw her son's leg free itself from the timber, the small limb bent at an unnatural angle. Mika didn't hesitate. She crawled toward Riku, pulling him into her arms, tears streaming down her face as she cradled his head against her chest. She kissed his forehead, murmuring apologies, promises of safety. She looked up at the soldier, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He was kneeling beside them now, panting heavily, but there was no time for rest. The sounds of battle were growing louder, the gunfire and explosions intensifying. The soldier's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance, before he motioned for them to move. "We have to go," he said urgently, his voice tight with fear. "Now." Mika nodded, lifting Riku into her arms, her legs shaky with the weight of him. She could feel the urgency in the air, the need to move before the next shell fell. The soldier was already on his feet, scanning the area for any signs of danger. He looked back at Mika, then at the wreckage around them. "I'll cover you," he said. "Just keep moving." Mika hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but the soldier was already moving ahead, crouching low as he stepped carefully through the rubble. His rifle was slung over his back, and his eyes constantly darted from side to side, watching for any movement.
Mika followed, her heart hammering in her chest. She stumbled over the debris, struggling to keep her balance as she carried Riku, his limp body heavy in her arms. Every step was a battle, each movement filled with the knowledge that they were not safe, that they were still very much in the midst of a war. As they moved through the village, the sounds of gunfire grew louder, the sharp cracks of rifles and the distant explosions of artillery mixing with the chaos of battle. The air was thick with smoke, and the dust clung to their clothes like a shroud. Mika could hear the soldier's footsteps ahead of her, his boots crunching against the broken earth. He turned every corner cautiously, scanning for any threats before giving the all-clear for them to follow. It felt like an eternity before they reached a relatively safe spot, a small alcove behind a collapsed building. The soldier motioned for Mika to stop, signaling that they had to rest for a moment. Mika sank to the ground, her legs giving way beneath her. She could feel the weight of everything crashing down on her. Her fear, her grief, the sheer exhaustion of the past few days. She looked down at Riku, who had fallen silent in her arms, his eyes closed in exhaustion. For a moment, everything around her seemed to fade, and all she could focus on was the weight of her son, the warmth of his tiny body in her arms. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding on to, how much she had been holding back until now, when she allowed herself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. The soldier was still standing, watching the horizon, his back to them as he kept a vigilant lookout. But his voice cut through the silence, soft but firm. "We can't stay here long. We need to move soon." Mika nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as she stood, preparing to continue the journey. She had no choice but to trust him, to follow him into the unknown. After all, he had just saved her son's life. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The journey from the wreckage of Mika's home to the safety of the American lines was a blur of dust, gunfire, and shattered buildings. Mika moved as quickly as she could, but the weight of Riku in her arms was a constant reminder of how fragile their escape was. She could feel his small body trembling, not from cold, but from the terror of the unknown. Each step she took seemed to take an eternity, as if the very earth beneath her feet was reluctant to let her leave the rubble of the village. The soldier, now a few paces ahead, constantly scanned the area, his rifle ready in case danger appeared from any direction. Mika's heart pounded as they moved through the destruction. The sounds of battle were all around them: distant artillery fire, the crack of sniper shots, and the constant hum of the air filled with tension. But in that moment, it wasn't the noise that consumed her. It was the weight of the silence between them. The soldier had saved her son's life, but there were still so many questions left unanswered. Who was this man who, in the face of certain death, had chosen to help them? Why had he risked so much for them? In the midst of the chaos and destruction, Mika felt a strange, almost inexplicable gratitude for him, a gratitude that transcended any language barrier or cultural divide. They continued on, taking cover when necessary, moving in and out of the shadows of collapsed structures. The air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Every corner they turned, every alley they crossed, felt like a gamble. One misstep, one wrong move, and they could be walking into the crossfire. Mika's thoughts raced, but there was no time to dwell on them. Every step was critical. There was no guarantee they would make it out of the village alive, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. As they approached a small makeshift shelter, the soldier held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. He crouched low, peering around the corner before gesturing for Mika to follow. She obeyed without question, her body still trembling with the stress of what they had just been through. Her son, who had been so silent in her arms, shifted slightly, and Mika looked down to see him awake, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. She whispered softly to him, hoping to calm him,
but deep down she knew that he was just as lost as she was. The world around them had been turned upside down in an instant, and nothing would ever be the same again.
The soldier moved to the front of the shelter, scanning the area for any signs of danger. Mika followed him, her eyes darting nervously, trying to make sense of the chaos that had become their world. They reached the shelter and ducked inside, where a few other American soldiers were already stationed, their rifles aimed out of the small windows at the perimeter. The tension in the air was palpable, but the soldiers were professional, efficient in their movements. There was no time for small talk, no time for pleasantries. They were here for one purpose: to survive. Mika sank to the ground, exhausted, her body aching from the strain of carrying Riku for so long. She looked around at the other soldiers, noting their worn faces and tired eyes. They were just like the man who had saved them, human, with fears and doubts, but determined to do their duty. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. They weren't just enemies anymore. They were people, fighting on opposite sides of a war that seemed impossible to understand. But in this moment, Mika couldn't afford to think about the politics of it all. She had to focus on her son, on keeping him safe, on getting through this day. The soldier who had saved Riku knelt beside her, his face drawn with exhaustion. His breathing was shallow, and Mika noticed the blood that had stained his uniform. He had been injured. She had seen the blood before, but now, up close, it was clear that he was more hurt than he had let on. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, and something inside her stirred: concern, empathy, but also a strange sense of responsibility. He had saved her son, had risked everything to help them, and now he was wounded. She couldn't let him suffer for his bravery. "You're hurt," Mika whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We need to get you help." He shook his head slightly, his lips curling into a tired smile. "I'll be fine," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "You need to focus on your son. We need to move as soon as we can. The fighting is only getting worse out there." Mika didn't know how to respond. She wanted to argue, to tell him that he couldn't just ignore his injuries. But the soldier's resolve was clear. He wasn't going to stop until they were safe. She nodded silently, her hands still trembling as she cradled Riku against her chest. Outside, the sounds of the battle intensified, a constant reminder of how fragile their safety was. The soldiers in the shelter moved with purpose, checking their weapons, preparing for the next phase of the mission. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the four of them: the soldier, Mika, her son, and the soldiers around them. They were all survivors, bound together by the raw, undeniable fact that they were living through something that none of them could fully comprehend. The soldier who had saved them turned to the others, issuing orders in a calm, controlled manner. His voice was firm, and Mika could sense the authority he carried despite his injuries. He was a leader, even in the midst of chaos, and the soldiers around him followed his orders without hesitation. There was something reassuring about that, something that made Mika believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance of making it out of this nightmare alive. But even as the soldiers prepared to move out, a heavy silence settled over the group. Everyone knew what was at stake. The fighting was only getting worse, and time was running out. But for the first time since this ordeal had begun, Mika felt a strange flicker of hope. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: her son was alive, and he was with her, and that, for now, was enough. The days that followed were a blur of movement, confusion, and exhaustion. Mika and Riku, along with a small group of American soldiers, had been forced to keep moving as the war raged on around them. Every step was fraught with danger, each corner a potential death trap. The shelter they had taken refuge in had been only temporary, and soon the soldiers made the decision to leave, pushing forward toward a safer location, one that was still within the American lines. The constant threat of enemy fire kept them on edge, but there was a quiet sense of resolve among the soldiers, a calm determination that seemed to ease some of Mika's anxiety. Though they had made it out of the immediate danger, Mika could still feel the weight of what had happened, the explosion, the destruction, the terrifying realization that she might never see her son safe again. But now, with Riku still in her arms and the soldiers guiding them through the ruins, she felt something stirring inside her, the faintest trace of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the first time in days that she had allowed herself to believe that survival was possible, that there might be a future beyond the war. Her son, still pale and silent, clung to her, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor. His once constant fear seemed to ease, if only for a moment. They moved at a slow, cautious pace, always alert to the sounds of approaching soldiers or artillery. The soldiers, too, were tired, their faces etched with the strain of the past few weeks. Their movements were precise, practiced, but there was a weariness in their eyes that spoke of the toll the war had taken on them. Even the young soldier who had saved Riku, the one who had risked his life without a second thought, seemed to carry an unspoken weight. His injuries, though not life-threatening, had clearly drained him, and Mika could see the pain in his face, though he never let it show. He was focused on the mission, and his determination to get them to safety was unwavering. As they continued their journey, Mika couldn't help but feel the stark contrast between the American soldiers and the enemy she had been taught to fear. They were not the monsters she had been led to believe. They were human, just like her. They bled, they hurt, they were afraid. They had families, loved ones, and their own reasons for being here. And one of them had saved her son, had put his life on the line to ensure that Riku was safe. For the first time in her life, Mika questioned everything she had been taught about the enemy. The lines between good and evil, right and wrong, had become blurred in a way she couldn't have imagined. By the time they reached the American camp, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the landscape. The air was still, and the sounds of battle seemed distant, as though the war itself was taking a brief pause. The camp was small but fortified, with soldiers stationed at every corner, watching over the perimeter with vigilant eyes. Mika and Riku were led to a small medical tent, where an American medic immediately took over, examining Riku for any injuries. She felt a strange sense of relief watching the medic's careful hands move over her son's body, checking for any signs of injury, and then cleaning his wounds with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. It was a surreal moment, one that Mika would never have believed possible. She was in the camp of the enemy, receiving help from the very soldiers she had been taught to fear. The world she had known, the world of black and white distinctions between friend and foe, was beginning to crumble. There was no enemy here, only people. People who had made different choices, people who had different values, but people all the same. She sat in silence, watching the medic work, as her mind replayed the events that had led them here. Later that evening, as Mika sat beside her son, now resting on a cot in the medical tent, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The soldier who had saved Riku, the one who had given his life for a child he didn't know, was still with them, though he had been taken to a separate tent for his injuries. Mika had not spoken to him since they had arrived at the camp, but she knew she would have to thank him, though words seemed so inadequate for what he had done. He had given them the chance to survive when it seemed impossible, and he had risked everything for a child who was nothing to him. As she sat in the quiet of the tent, the sounds of the camp around her, Mika's thoughts drifted to the future. What would become of them now? Would they ever return to their village, to their home? Would there be a place for them in the world that had been torn apart by this war? She didn't know the answers to these questions, and for the first time in days, she realized that it didn't matter. They had survived. Her son was alive, and in that moment, that was all that mattered.
Mika looked down at Riku, his small body finally relaxed in sleep. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the American soldiers who had saved them, but for the very fact that they had made it through the worst of it. They were not out of danger yet, but the worst was behind them. As she ran her fingers through her son's hair, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. She wasn't sure who or what she was thanking, but in this moment, she didn't care. All that mattered was that they had a chance at life, and that they were no longer trapped in the darkness of war. The next day, when Mika and Riku were ready to leave the medical tent, she found the soldier who had saved them waiting for her outside. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear, and his posture was one of quiet strength. He was tired, but there was a softness in his gaze that told her everything she needed to know. Without a word, Mika approached him, her heart full of gratitude. She reached out and took his hand, holding it firmly, silently thanking him for everything he had done. He gave her a small smile, but there were no words. None were needed. As they left the camp, heading toward the uncertain future that lay ahead, Mika knew that the world would never be the same. The war was still raging, but something had shifted inside her. The man who had been her enemy had become her savior, and in that shift she realized that humanity could still prevail, even in the darkest of times. She would never forget what had happened in those days, what had been done for her and her son. And for the rest of her life she would carry that memory with her, not as a symbol of war, but as a reminder of the power of compassion and the possibility of redemption.